Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most forbidden worlds, the world that existed right under the marble columns and golden statues of ancient Rome. Picture this. While senators debated in the Forum and gladiators fought in the Colosseum, nearly 1 in every 15 women in Rome was selling her body to survive. That's over 45,000 women in a single city. But here's what will shock you. These weren't just desperate women hiding in dark alleys. Some of them lived in luxury that would make modern celebrities jealous, while others suffered in conditions so brutal that death seemed like mercy. Tonight, I'm going to take you inside their actual daily lives, reveal the economic empire they built, and show you how their stories challenge everything you think you know about women, power, and survival in the ancient world. Now, before we step through the marble doorways of ancient Rome together, I'd love it if you could show this channel some support. Hit that subscribe button if you're ready for more deep dives into history's untold stories, and give this video a like if you're as fascinated by these hidden truths as I am. I'm genuinely curious. Where are you watching this from tonight? Are you tucked into bed in New York? Or maybe relaxing after a long day in California? Drop a comment and let me know what drew you to this story. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's travel back 2,000 years to discover what really happened behind closed doors in the Eternal City. You know, when most people think about ancient Rome, they picture the stuff from movies, gleaming temples, noble senators in white togas, and maybe Russell Crowe fighting lions. But the reality was far more complex and, honestly, far more human than Hollywood wants you to believe. The Rome I'm about to show you tonight had streets that reeked of urine and fish sauce, where the wealthy literally lived above the poor, and where sex was sold as casually as bread or wine. Here's something that might surprise you. Prostitution wasn't just legal in ancient Rome, it was actually considered essential to society. The Romans believed that if men didn't have access to prostitutes, they'd commit adultery with respectable women, and that would bring down the entire social order. So they didn't just tolerate sex work, they regulated it, taxed it, and built an entire infrastructure around it. Think of it as the world's oldest regulated industry. But here's where it gets really interesting. Roman prostitution wasn't one single thing. It was like a pyramid with dozens of different levels, each with its own rules, clients, and daily realities. At the very top, you had women who were essentially the ancient equivalent of high-end escorts, mixed with university professors. These women could recite Homer from memory, play musical instruments, and engage in philosophical debates that would put modern intellectuals to shame. They lived in beautiful homes, or silk imported from China, and some even owned their own businesses. Then you had the middle tier, women who worked in established brothels or taverns, who had regular clients and relatively stable lives. And at the bottom, well, at the bottom were women who quite literally lived and worked in underground cells that were barely big enough for a single person to lie down. The contrast was so extreme that these women might as well have been living in different worlds entirely. What fascinates me most is how the Romans documented all of this. They weren't shy about it at all. Archaeologists have found detailed graffiti in Pompeii, messages scratched into brothel walls by clients rating their experiences, like ancient Yelp reviews. Athenaeus charges 2 denarii, but she's worth it. Amaryllis has good technique. These weren't hidden or shameful transactions. They were part of daily Roman life. And here's something that might make you rethink everything about ancient versus modern attitudes towards sexuality. While Romans were remarkably open about prostitution, they were actually quite conservative about many other aspects of sex. A respectable Roman wife was expected to be almost invisible in public, While a successful prostitute might be the most educated and worldly woman in the neighborhood, the contradictions were everywhere. But tonight isn't just about the contradictions, it's about the women themselves. Real women with names, dreams, fears, and incredibly complex lives. Women like Cytheris, who started as a slave in a brothel, but became so accomplished that she ended up as the mistress of Mark Antony himself. Yes, the same Mark Antony who later fell for Cleopatra, or women whose names we'll never know, who left behind only a few lines of graffiti expressing hope for freedom, or love for a child they'd never see again. What I find most remarkable is that despite living in a world where they had almost no legal rights, many of these women found ways to gain real power and influence. They became confidants to politicians, advisors to merchants, and sometimes even wealthy business owners in their own right. They navigated a system designed to exploit them and, in many cases, found ways to turn it to their advantage. As we dive deeper into their world over the next few hours, you're going to discover that these women weren't victims in the way we might expect, nor were they empowered in the way modern narratives might suggest. They were something much more complex, survivors and strategists operating within one of history's most fascinating and contradictory societies. You'll hear stories that range from heartbreaking to inspiring to absolutely shocking. We'll explore how a woman's daily routine might include everything from literary discussions with senators to life-threatening encounters with violent clients. We'll uncover the economic realities that made some prostitutes wealthier than merchants, while others struggled to afford a single meal. Most importantly, we'll discover how their stories illuminate not just ancient Rome, but human nature itself, our capacity for both cruelty and kindness, exploitation and empowerment, survival and transformation. So settle in, because we're about to step through the entrance of ancient Rome's most notorious neighborhood, where marble facades hide stories that are sometimes beautiful, often brutal, and always deeply human. In just a moment, we'll walk down the narrow streets of the Suburra, past the taverns and brothels where these women lived and worked, and I'll show you exactly what their world looked, sounded, and even smelled like. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you're standing at the entrance to the Suburra, Rome's most infamous neighborhood. The first thing that hits you isn't what you see, it's what you smell. A thick mixture of unwashed bodies, burning oil lamps, cheap wine, and something else. Something distinctly human that makes your stomach turn slightly. This isn't the Rome of marble statues and pristine temples. This is where real life happened, where survival was an art form, and where the night belonged to a different kind of Roman citizen entirely. The Suburra sat in a valley between Rome's hills, and during the day, it was actually a bustling commercial district. Respectable merchants sold everything from exotic spices to handmade pottery. But as the sun began to set and shadows grew long across the narrow streets, a transformation occurred that would make Jekyll and Hyde jealous. The daytime merchants packed up their wares, locked their shops, and headed home to safer neighborhoods. And then, the night shift began. Picture walking down these streets as darkness falls. The buildings tower above you, some reaching 5 or even 6 stories high, which was absolutely massive for ancient times. These weren't the sturdy structures you might imagine. They were hastily built, overcrowded tenements that swayed in strong winds and occasionally just collapsed. The wealthy Romans called them insulae, which literally means islands, because they stood isolated in a sea of poverty and desperation. But here's what's fascinating. The ground floors of these buildings housed some of the most sophisticated businesses in the ancient world. Not just any businesses, the kind that required serious customer service skills, emotional intelligence, and what we'd now call hospitality management. These were the lupanars, the brothels of ancient Rome, and they were architectural marvels in their own right. When archaeologists excavated Pompeii, they discovered something remarkable about these establishments. The most famous lupanar there had 10 small rooms, each just barely wide enough for a narrow bed. But here's the detail that gives me chills every time I think about it. Above each doorway, there were explicit frescoes showing exactly what services were available inside. These weren't crude drawings. They were sophisticated artwork created by skilled painters. It was like having a visual menu for customers who might not speak Latin. The floors were made of stone, not wood, and there's a heartbreaking practical reason for this. Stone was easier to clean and disinfect. The Romans understood disease transmission better than we often give them credit for, and they knew that hygiene could mean the difference between life and death in these close quarters. Each room had a small window near the ceiling, not for romance or ambience, but for ventilation. These women were working in spaces that were essentially stone boxes, but every architectural detail was designed around the brutal efficiency of commerce. But the Subura wasn't just about the brothels. The entire neighborhood was an ecosystem built around the night economy. There were taverns where watered-down wine flowed freely, and where conversations happened in a dozen different languages. Roman soldiers on leave, foreign merchants, freed slaves with a few coins to spend, and yes, even the occasional senator who'd snuck away from his respectable life for a few hours of adventure. The noise level at night must have been incredible. Imagine the sounds, laughter spilling out of tavern doorways, the clatter of dice games, street musicians playing for coins, and underneath it all, the constant murmur of negotiation and commerce. This wasn't a silent, shameful world hidden from view. This was Rome's nightlife, as open and bustling as Times Square. Here's something that might surprise you about the architecture. Many of these buildings had internal courtyards where women could gather during their breaks. Archaeologists have found evidence of small gardens, fountain areas, and even spaces that might have been used for informal markets where the women traded personal items or food. These weren't just places of business. They were communities. The streets themselves tell their own story. They were narrow, barely wide enough for two people to pass, and they followed no logical pattern whatsoever. This wasn't accidental. The maze-like layout provided protection and privacy. If authorities wanted to crack down on certain activities, or if rival gangs decided to cause trouble, there were dozens of escape routes and hiding places. The geography itself was designed around survival. And then there were the signs. Oh, the signs. Romans loved their advertising, and the Subura was covered in graffiti that functioned as a primitive form of social media. Felix was here with Fortunata. She's amazing. Avoid Glycera on Tuesdays. She's always drunk. Marcus owes me 3 denarii for last week. These walls were covered in reviews, warnings, appointments, and personal messages that give us an incredibly intimate glimpse into daily life. The lighting at night came from oil lamps and torches, creating this flickering, almost dreamlike atmosphere. But don't romanticize it too much. Oil was expensive, so most areas were only dimly lit. The shadows were deep and numerous, and they hid both romance and violence in equal measure. A woman might entertain a gentle poet in one room, while her neighbor dealt with a soldier who'd had too much wine and too little patience. What really gets to me is how the Romans normalized all of this through urban planning. The Subura wasn't hidden away on the outskirts of the city. It was right in the heart of Rome, within walking distance of the Forum and the major temples. The message was clear. This was part of Roman society, not something to be ashamed of or hidden away. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Subura was how it functioned as a social safety net, albeit a brutal one. Women who had nowhere else to go, runaway slaves, war widows, daughters of families who couldn't afford dowries, they all ended up here. And while the conditions were harsh, it was still better than starvation or slavery in the mines. The neighborhood provided not just survival, but sometimes even opportunity for those clever and strong enough to seize it. As dawn approached each day, the Subura would gradually transform back into its daytime identity. The night workers would retreat to their rooms to sleep, the taverns would close, and the respectable merchants would return to open their shops. It was like watching a city change costumes, preparing for an entirely different performance. But the women who called this place home, they lived in both worlds, the shadowy nighttime economy and the harsh light of Roman social reality. And understanding their daily navigation between these two worlds reveals something profound about human adaptability and the lengths people will go to not just survive, but to find dignity and even power in the most unlikely circumstances. Now that you've seen the stage where these incredible stories unfolded, you're ready to meet the players themselves. Because what you'll discover next is that not all women in this world were created equal, not even close. The hierarchy that existed within Roman prostitution was so complex and so rigid that a woman's place in it determined everything from what she ate for breakfast to whether she'd live to see her next birthday. If you thought all prostitutes in ancient Rome lived the same brutal existence, prepare to have your mind completely blown. The social hierarchy within Roman sex work was so extreme, so carefully structured, that women at different levels might as well have been living on different planets. We're talking about a system where one woman could own a villa with heated floors and imported silk curtains, while another woman just blocks away slept on straw in a cell smaller than your bathroom. The Romans didn't just organize their sex trade, they turned it into the world's first stratified service industry. Let me paint you a picture that will shock you. At the very top of this pyramid sat women called delicatae, literally meaning delicate ones. These weren't just prostitutes, they were living works of art. Think of them as a fusion of Harvard professors, Broadway performers, and high-end therapists all rolled into one incredibly sophisticated package. A delicata might charge the equivalent of what a skilled craftsman earned in 3 months for a single evening. And here's the kicker. Wealthy Romans often fought over the privilege of booking them. These elite women lived in houses that would make modern celebrities jealous. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii shows us courtesan residences with intricate mosaic floors, private bathrooms with running water, and rooms specifically designed for entertaining that were larger than most Romans' entire homes. One excavated courtesan's house had a private library containing over 200 scrolls. That's like having a personal university in your home when most people couldn't even read their own names. But here's what really sets your brain spinning. These top-tier women weren't just selling sex. They were selling an entire lifestyle experience. A wealthy Roman didn't just visit a delicata for physical pleasure. He came for intellectual stimulation, cultural refinement, and social networking that his own wife, bound by strict social conventions, simply couldn't provide. These women could discuss philosophy with Stoic scholars, recite poetry in 3 languages, and debate politics with the sharp wit that Roman society absolutely worshipped. Now, drop down just one level in this hierarchy, and you encounter the meretrices, professional courtesans who operated more like what we'd recognize as high-end escorts today. These women had regular clientele, operated from decent apartments or small houses, and maintained something resembling normal business hours. A meretrix might see 3 to 5 clients per week, each paying enough to keep her comfortably fed, clothed, and housed. She probably couldn't afford silk from China, but she could manage a nice wool dress and maybe some basic jewelry. The meretresses developed fascinating survival strategies that revealed just how business savvy these women had to be. Many specialized in particular services or client types. Some became known for their skills in conversation and companionship, essentially ancient therapy sessions. Others built reputations as party planners who could organize entertainments for wealthy Romans. Some even functioned as informal banks, lending money to clients or holding valuables for safekeeping. They turned their social positions into diversified income streams that would impress modern entrepreneurs. But then we hit the middle tier, and things get darker. The prostibuli worked in established brothels under the management of a leno or lena, essentially pimps who controlled every aspect of their lives. These women might see 10 to 15 clients per day, earning just enough to pay for their room, board, and a small personal allowance. They lived in the upper floors of the lupanars we visited earlier, sharing cramped quarters with 2 or 3 other women. The prostibuli faced a constant balancing act that required incredible psychological strength. They had to appear enthusiastic and engaging for each client, while emotionally protecting themselves from the brutal reality of their situations. Many developed elaborate mental techniques, creating fictional personas, practicing meditation-like focus, or forming tight bonds with other women that function as informal therapy networks. And then, at the bottom of this crushing hierarchy, were the lupae, literally meaning she-wolves. These women worked the streets, taverns, and the absolute cheapest establishments. They might service 20 or more clients in a single day for prices so low that they barely covered basic survival needs. The name lupae tells you everything about how Roman society viewed them, not as humans, but as predatory animals driven by base instincts. Here's what's heartbreaking. The lupae often included women who had fallen from higher levels of the hierarchy. A meretrix who became too old, or got pregnant, or developed a reputation for being difficult might find herself forced down into street-level work. The Roman system showed no mercy for women who couldn't maintain their market value. But here's where it gets really complex. This hierarchy wasn't just about money or social status. It was about legal protection, personal safety, and basic human dignity. A delicata who faced a violent client could appeal to wealthy patrons for protection, or even legal intervention. A lupa who encountered the same situation had no recourse whatsoever. The higher up you were in this system, the more you resembled an actual human being in the eyes of Roman law and society. The Romans even developed a color-coding system for different levels of sex workers. Elite courtesans could wear gold jewelry and expensive fabrics in rich purples and blues. Mid-level workers wore simpler tunics in earth tones. And lupae were actually required by law to wear specific colors, usually yellow or flame-colored garments, that immediately identified their profession and status to everyone they encountered. What fascinates historians is how this hierarchy created its own microeconomy within Roman society. Women at different levels rarely interacted with each other, but they were all part of an interconnected system. Elite courtesans might hire lower-level women as maids or assistants. Mid-level workers might share resources or form informal partnerships. Even lupae developed networks of mutual support that helped them survive the harshest conditions. The psychological impact of this system was profound. Women internalized these hierarchies so completely that they often became their own enforcers. A meretrix might look down on a prostibula with the same disdain that respectable Roman wives showed toward all sex workers. It was a brilliant and brutal form of social control that kept women from uniting against the system that exploited them all. But perhaps most remarkably, this hierarchy was fluid in ways that might surprise you. While it was rare, Women could and did move between levels. A clever looper might save enough money to buy her freedom and establish herself as a meretrix. The talented prostibula might catch the eye of a wealthy patron and rise to courtesan status. The system was oppressive, but it wasn't completely static. The Romans documented these hierarchies obsessively because they were genuinely proud of how organized and efficient their sex trade was. They saw it as evidence of their superior civilization, the fact that they could create such sophisticated social structures around even the most basic human needs. Understanding this hierarchy is crucial because it explains so much about how these women navigated their daily lives, formed relationships, and survived in a world designed to use them up and discard them. Each level required different skills, different strategies, and different forms of psychological armor. And now that you understand the ladder these women were climbing or falling down, you're ready to step into the private world of those who reach the very top. Because the daily life of a high-end Roman courtesan was so extraordinary, so filled with luxury and learning and genuine power, that it challenges everything we think we know about women's lives in the ancient world. The reality hits you like a punch to the stomach when you realize that for every luxurious villa on Palatine Hill, there were hundreds of women whose entire world consisted of a stone cell barely large enough for a straw mattress. Meet Flavia, not her real name, because we don't know her real name. History forgot women like her almost entirely. Through graffiti scratched into brothel walls and fragments of legal documents, we can piece together what her daily existence actually looked like, and it's both heartbreaking and surprisingly complex. Flavia's day begins before dawn, in a windowless room that's exactly 7 Roman feet long and 4 feet wide. We know this because Roman architects were obsessively consistent in their brothel designs. The walls are bare stone, damp with condensation, and the only furnishing is a narrow bed with a straw mattress that she shares with whoever is working the previous shift. There's no privacy, no personal belongings, and definitely no silk curtains or imported figs. But here's something that might surprise you. Flavia doesn't wake up naturally. She's awakened by the sound of the city's public slaves cleaning the streets with buckets of water and stiff brushes. This is important because it tells us that even the lowest tier sex workers were part of Rome's urban rhythm. The city ran on schedules, and everyone, from senators to street prostitutes, lived according to those rhythms. Her first task of the day is something that reveals the brutal efficiency of Roman brothel management: cleaning. Not just herself, but her workspace. The stone floors had to be scrubbed with a mixture of water and vinegar being one of the few antiseptics available in ancient times. The Romans understood that disease spread quickly in close quarters, so cleanliness wasn't about dignity, it was about protecting their investment. Flavia spends her first hour on her hands and knees, preparing her room for the day's business. Breakfast, if you can call it that, consists of whatever scraps are left from the tavern downstairs, usually bread so stale it has to be soaked in watered-down wine to be edible, and maybe some olives that are past their prime. But here's what's fascinating. Even this meager meal follows strict Roman customs. The bread is still blessed in the traditional way, and the wine, however diluted, is still mixed according to proper proportions. Even in the depths of poverty, Roman cultural practices persisted. Around midday, when respectable Romans are taking their afternoon rest, Flavia's real workday begins. But here's where the historical record gets really specific and really disturbing. Graffiti from Pompeii tells us that street-level prostitutes typically saw between 15 and 20 clients per day. That's roughly 1 every 30 minutes during peak hours. The prices were standardized and posted. 2 denarii for basic services, which was about what a laborer earned in a single day. But the mechanical nature of these transactions hides something more complex that archaeologists have only recently begun to understand. These women developed elaborate survival strategies that were, in their own way, as sophisticated as anything Cythera employed. They created coded languages to warn each other about violent clients. They developed systems for sharing information about which soldiers had money and which were likely to cause trouble. They even had informal networks for medical care, sharing knowledge about preventing pregnancy and treating diseases. The afternoon heat in Rome was brutal, especially in the cramped quarters of the Subura where the stone buildings trapped hot air like ovens. But Flavia couldn't rest. Roman working hours were dictated by the movement of the sun, and brothels operated on a schedule as rigid as any modern business. Peak hours were from noon until evening, when workers got off their jobs and soldiers finished their duties. Here's something that will break your heart. Despite the dehumanizing conditions, these women maintained small rituals of dignity and personal identity. Archaeologists have found tiny personal altars in brothel rooms, miniature shrines to household gods, hidden under loose floorboards or tucked into wall crevices. Flavia, despite having almost nothing, still found ways to practice her religious beliefs and maintain some connection to her humanity. The evening brought a different kind of challenge. As the taverns filled up and wine flowed more freely, clients became more unpredictable. Violence was a constant threat, and there was no real legal protection for women in Flavia's position. But here's where the community aspect of these establishments becomes crucial. The women developed elaborate systems of mutual protection. A specific whistle pattern meant help needed. Certain phrases shouted loudly enough were code for call the bouncer. They created their own security networks because Roman law offered them none. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Flavia's daily life was her economic situation. Yes, she was essentially enslaved and brutally exploited. But within that system, she still had to manage money, negotiate prices, and plan for her future, however limited those options might be. Some women at this level managed to save tiny amounts over time, planning for the day when age or illness would force them out of the trade. It was a microscopic version of financial planning, but it shows that even in the worst circumstances, humans find ways to hope and strategize. The night shift brought its own particular horrors and small mercies. Fewer clients, but often more dangerous ones, drunken soldiers, criminals avoiding the day patrol, and men whose wives thought they were safely asleep at home. But there were also moments of unexpected human connection. A client who was gentle and treated her like a person, a fellow worker who shared a bit of extra food, a moment of laughter that made the misery temporarily bearable. Sleep, when it finally came, was often interrupted. The buildings were so poorly constructed that every footstep, every conversation, every business transaction echoed through the thin walls. Privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist at this level of Roman society. Even unconsciousness offered only limited escape from the grinding reality of daily survival. Here's what's remarkable about women like Flavia. They survived, not just physically, though that was an accomplishment in itself given the health hazards and violence they faced. They survived psychologically by creating meaning, community, and dignity in circumstances designed to strip all of those things away. They formed families of choice with other women in similar situations. They maintained religious practices that connected them to something larger than their immediate circumstances. They found ways to laugh, to love, and to hope even in the darkest conditions. The documentation of their lives is fragmentary, but what survives suggests that many of these women possessed remarkable strength and resourcefulness. They had to be skilled negotiators, amateur psychologists, medical self-advocates, and financial managers, all while navigating a society that saw them as barely human. The fact that they maintained any sense of self at all under these conditions speaks to something incredible about human resilience. Understanding Flavia's world is crucial because it represents the reality for the vast majority of women in Roman sex work. For every famous courtesan whose name survived in historical records, there were hundreds of women whose stories were written only in scratches on stone walls, and whose lives ended without leaving any trace in official histories. But the story of Roman prostitution isn't just about the extremes of luxury and misery. Most women existed somewhere in the complex middle ground between Cytheris' villa and Flavia's cell. And understanding how they navigated that middle ground reveals something profound about the choices available to women in the ancient world, and the incredible variety of paths that led them to this profession in the first place. What if I told you that the path into Roman prostitution was so diverse, so unexpected, that it included everyone from kidnapped princesses to ambitious farm girls seeking economic independence? The stories of how women ended up in this world will challenge every assumption you have about ancient society, victimhood, and the complex choices people made when survival was never guaranteed. Let's start with perhaps the most shocking reality. Not every woman in Roman sex work was forced into it. I know that sounds impossible given what we've just seen, but bear with me. Meet Claudia, a freed woman whose story was preserved in a series of legal documents from the 1st century CE. Claudia was born to free parents who owned a small farm outside Rome. When a series of bad harvests left her family in desperate debt, she made a calculated decision that would horrify modern sensibilities, but made perfect economic sense in ancient Rome. At age 19, Claudia voluntarily entered into a contract with a brothel owner in the Subura, not as a slave, but as an independent contractor. The contract, written on papyrus and preserved in Egypt's dry climate, shows that she negotiated her own terms. She would work for 3 years, keep 30% of her earnings, and receive training in literacy and basic accounting. Her goal wasn't just survival. It was accumulating enough money to buy land and establish herself as an independent businesswoman. And here's the kicker. It worked. Tax records from 3 years later show Claudia purchasing a small vineyard and establishing herself as a wine merchant. She went on to become one of the wealthiest women in her region, eventually employing dozens of workers and owning property throughout central Italy. Her voluntary entry into sex work was a calculated investment in her future that paid off spectacularly. But Claudia's story represents just one pathway among dozens. The Roman Empire's constant warfare created a steady stream of captive women who ended up in brothels through no choice of their own. Take the case of Berenice, a Jewish princess captured during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Historical accounts describe her being paraded through Rome in triumph before being sold to a brothel owner who specialized in exotic women for wealthy clients who fantasized about bedding foreign royalty. Berenice's education and royal bearing made her incredibly valuable in the high-end market, but her psychological trauma was documented in letters she managed to smuggle out to Jewish communities throughout the empire. She wrote about the surreal experience of maintaining royal dignity while being treated as property, and how she used her political knowledge to provide intelligence to clients who were planning military campaigns in the East. Her story reveals how war created a pipeline of educated, high-status women who brought skills and connections that brothel owners could exploit. Then there were the debt slaves, women whose families sold them to pay off financial obligations. Roman law was very specific about this. If a family couldn't repay debts, creditors could claim family members as compensation. Daughters were often the first to go because Roman society valued sons more highly for carrying on family names and businesses. A legal document from Pompeii records the sale of 16-year-old Livia by her father to cover gambling debts totaling 200 denarii. The contract specifies that she could buy back her freedom for double the original debt, but with interest accumulating daily, this was essentially impossible. What's fascinating is how these different backgrounds created distinct subcultures within Roman prostitution. Former slaves brought survival skills and knowledge of how to navigate Roman social hierarchies. War captives often possessed education and cultural knowledge that made them valuable as courtesans. Debt slaves frequently maintained family connections that sometimes led to eventual freedom or improved circumstances. But perhaps the most complex category were the freed women. Former slaves who'd been granted or purchased their freedom, but found themselves with limited economic options. Roman law severely restricted what occupations freed women could enter. They couldn't become teachers, priestesses, or legitimate merchants without male sponsors. But sex work was one of the few professions where a woman could operate independently and potentially accumulate real wealth. Aelia Fortunata represents this group beautifully. Born a slave in a wealthy household, she was freed when her master died and left her a small inheritance in his will. But freedom without resources was almost meaningless in Roman society. She used her inheritance to establish herself as a mid-level courtesan, specializing in services for wealthy merchants who valued her literacy and knowledge of household management. Within 5 years, she had saved enough money to purchase the freedom of her sister and establish a small business training other freed women in courtesan skills. The economic calculations these women made reveal something profound about Roman society. For many women, sex work represented the best available path to financial independence and social mobility. It was dangerous, stigmatizing, and often brutal, but it was also one of the few ways a woman could accumulate capital and make independent business decisions. Here's something that will surprise you. Roman prostitution also included women who were essentially failed entrepreneurs. The empire's merchant economy was volatile and risky, and women who invested in shipping, wine production, or textile manufacturing sometimes lost everything when markets shifted or ships sank. Rather than face destitution, some chose to enter sex work temporarily to rebuild their capital. Legal records show several cases of women who moved back and forth between legitimate business and prostitution as economic conditions changed. The most heartbreaking category were the abandoned children. Roman law allowed fathers to expose unwanted infants, essentially leaving them to die or be picked up by whoever found them. Girls were abandoned far more frequently than boys, and those who survived were often raised specifically for the sex trade. These women had no memory of any other life, no family connections, and no legal identity beyond their value as sexual commodities. But even within this grim reality, some found ways to create meaning and purpose. Archaeological evidence from brothels shows that women who had been raised in the trade often became informal leaders who protected younger newcomers, taught survival skills, and maintained the cultural traditions they remembered from their early lives. They created family structures within the brothels that provided emotional support and practical protection. What's remarkable is how these different backgrounds influenced the services women provided and the clients they attracted. Former household slaves understood the domestic routines of wealthy Romans and could provide companionship that felt familiar and comfortable. War captives brought exotic allure and often possessed skills in dance, music, or storytelling from their home cultures. Freed women with business experience could offer financial advice and networking opportunities that wealthy clients genuinely valued. The Roman legal system actually recognized these distinctions and created different categories of regulation for different types of sex workers. Women who entered the trade voluntarily had certain legal protections that weren't available to slaves. Those who could prove they were temporarily in the profession to pay off debts had different tax obligations than career prostitutes. The bureaucracy of sex work was as complex as any other Roman industry. Understanding these diverse pathways into prostitution is crucial because it helps us grasp the true complexity of women's lives in ancient Rome. These weren't just victims or villains. They were human beings making rational decisions within the constraints of their society, using whatever resources and opportunities were available to them. But once these women were established in the trade, regardless of how they got there, they all faced the same fundamental challenge: how to attract and keep clients in one of the most competitive markets in the ancient world. And the men they served represented an equally diverse cross-section of Roman society, each bringing their own needs, fantasies, and expectations to these transactions. Imagine walking into what you think is a brothel and discovering it's actually part university, part therapy clinic, part business networking event, and part cultural embassy all rolled into one. The men who sought out Roman sex workers came from every corner of the empire, and their diversity created a marketplace so complex that successful women had to become masters of psychology, linguistics, economics, and diplomacy just to survive. The most shocking revelation about Roman clients isn't who they were, it's what they actually wanted. Yes, sexual services were part of the equation, but surviving business records and personal letters reveal that many clients were paying for something far more complex and emotionally sophisticated than simple physical pleasure. Take Marcus Crassus Frugi, a wealthy grain merchant whose detailed expense record survived in a villa outside Pompeii. Over the course of a year, he paid regular visits to a courtesan named Demetria, and his accounting ledger reveals exactly what he was purchasing. Only about 30% of his payments were for what the records euphemistically called personal services. The rest, he was paying for business consultation, language tutoring, and what we'd now recognize as therapy sessions. Demetria, you see, was originally from Alexandria and spoke fluent Greek, Egyptian, and Latin. Crassus was expanding his grain trading into Eastern markets and needed someone who could teach him commercial Greek, explain Egyptian business customs, and help him navigate the complex cultural protocols of international trade. His brothel visits were essentially graduate-level business school sessions that happened to include physical intimacy as a bonus. But Crassus wasn't unusual. Roman society created enormous psychological pressure on men that they couldn't address through normal channels. Elite Roman males were expected to be stoic, controlled, and emotionally invulnerable at all times. They couldn't show weakness to their wives, their business partners, or their political allies. But with a skilled courtesan, they could finally let their guard down and process the stress, fear, and uncertainty that came with wielding power in a cutthroat society. A fascinating papyrus from Egypt contains what amounts to a therapy session between a Roman governor and a Greek courtesan named Hermione. The governor pours out his anxieties about managing a province on the edge of rebellion, his fears about assassination attempts, and his guilt over military decisions that resulted in civilian casualties. Hermione responds with sophisticated psychological insights, helping him work through his emotional responses and develop coping strategies. This wasn't pillow talk. It was professional mental health care disguised as a sexual transaction. The military clientele brought their own unique psychological needs. Roman soldiers lived with constant violence and death, often in foreign lands where they couldn't communicate with local populations. Many sought out sex workers not just for physical release, but for emotional connection with someone who spoke their language and understood their experiences. Veterans' accounts describe brothels as the only places where they felt safe expressing vulnerability. A graffito from a military brothel near Hadrian's Wall reads, Gaius Valerius, centurion of the 3rd Legion, spoke here about his nightmares. Claudia listened and helped him sleep. This wasn't advertising. It was a testimonial to therapeutic services that would be familiar to any modern trauma counselor. But perhaps the most surprising client category were the foreign diplomats and merchants who used Roman sex workers as cultural interpreters and intelligence sources. A courtesan who serviced clients from multiple social levels became an invaluable source of information about everything from military movements to political gossip to economic trends. Syrian merchants planning trade routes would visit courtesans who specialized in serving Roman officials, hoping to learn about upcoming military campaigns that might affect shipping lanes. Germanic tribal leaders negotiating with Rome sought out women who entertained senators, trying to gauge Roman attitudes toward particular treaties. Egyptian priests establishing temples in Roman cities hired courtesans to teach them the subtle social protocols that could make or break their religious missions. The language skills that successful sex workers developed were absolutely staggering. Inscriptions from Pompeii show women advertising fluency in Latin, Greek, Aramaic, Germanic dialects, Gallic, and even some Celtic languages. They weren't just learning basic communication. They were mastering the cultural nuances, religious references, and business terminology that allowed them to provide sophisticated services to clients from across the known world. But the intellectual services didn't stop at language and culture. Many Roman courtesans became walking libraries of practical knowledge that their clients desperately needed. A freedman trying to establish himself in Roman society might hire a courtesan to teach him proper etiquette, table manners, and social customs. Foreign merchants needed lessons in Roman commercial law, tax regulations, and guild membership requirements. One of the most remarkable examples comes from the port city of Ostia, where a courtesan named Faustina specialized in serving ship captains and maritime traders. Her surviving business correspondence shows that she provided services that included weather prediction, navigation advice, and detailed information about port facilities throughout the Mediterranean. She had essentially created a one-woman maritime consulting business that used sexual services as a loss leader to attract clients for her more lucrative informational offerings. The religious and spiritual services that some courtesans provided might be the most surprising aspect of all. In a polytheistic society where different gods governed different aspects of life, many Romans sought spiritual guidance from women who weren't bound by the strict religious hierarchies that controlled official temples. A fascinating legal document describes a case where a courtesan named Livia was accused of practicing unauthorized religious rituals. The details reveal that she was performing blessing ceremonies for clients who were embarking on dangerous journeys, providing amulets and conducting prayers that combined Roman, Greek, and Egyptian religious elements. Her clients included merchants, soldiers, and even some senators who preferred her flexible spiritual approach to the rigid protocols of state religion. The networking opportunities that brothels provided were as valuable as any services the women themselves offered. In a society where business was conducted through personal relationships and political advancement depended on social connections, the informal gathering spaces around sex work became crucial venues for deal-making and alliance building. Taverns attached to brothels functioned as neutral meeting grounds where men from different social classes, ethnic backgrounds, and political factions could interact without the formal protocols that governed other social settings. A Syrian merchant might strike up a conversation with a Roman senator while both waited for appointments, leading to trade agreements that would never have been possible in formal diplomatic settings. The economic sophistication of these relationships becomes clear when you realize that many long-term client relationships were essentially subscription-based services, Wealthy Romans would contract with specific courtesans for ongoing access to their various skills, paying monthly retainers rather than per-visit fees. These arrangements often included provisions for exclusive access during certain periods, priority booking during busy seasons, and even intellectual property agreements about confidentiality regarding sensitive business or political information. What emerges from all this evidence is a picture of Roman sex work as an incredibly sophisticated service industry that provided far more than sexual pleasure. These women were cultural ambassadors, business consultants, therapists, teachers, spiritual advisors, and networking facilitators all rolled into one. They filled gaps in Roman society that no other institution could address, providing services that were essential to the functioning of a multicultural empire. But all of these complex services and relationships operated within an economic framework that was just as sophisticated as the services themselves. The money that flowed through Roman sex work created a parallel economy with its own rules, hierarchies, and power structures that will absolutely blow your mind when you see how it actually worked. Here's something that will completely rewrite your understanding of ancient economics. Roman prostitution generated more annual revenue than the empire's grain trade. Let me say that again. Sex work was literally one of the largest industries in the ancient world. With a financial ecosystem so sophisticated that it included everything from venture capital to franchising to what we'd now recognize as private equity firms, the money flowing through this industry didn't just support the women involved, it funded construction projects, political campaigns, and even military expeditions. The numbers are absolutely staggering when you break them down. Conservative estimates suggest that Rome's sex trade generated over 200 million denarii annually. That's roughly equivalent to $2.5 billion in today's purchasing power. To put that in perspective, the entire Roman military budget was only about 150 million denarii per year. The sex industry was literally funding the empire. But here's where it gets really fascinating. The Romans treated sex work like any other major industry, complete with detailed accounting, taxation systems, and regulatory oversight. Tax records from Pompeii show that brothel revenues were meticulously tracked, with different rates applied to different types of services and different classes of workers. The government wasn't just tolerating this industry, they were managing it like a strategic economic asset. Let's follow the money trail through a typical mid-level brothel to understand how this economic machine actually worked. Take the villa of the Lupanars in Pompeii, which archaeologists have reconstructed in incredible financial detail, thanks to preserved business records and accounting tablets. The building itself was a major capital investment. Construction costs, based on preserved contractor receipts, totaled about 15,000 denarii, equivalent to building a small luxury home. But the ongoing operational expenses reveal the true complexity of the business. Monthly costs included rent for the building, salaries for security guards, payments to local officials for protection, food and supplies for the workers, medical care from private physicians, and even marketing expenses for street criers who advertised the establishment's services. The revenue streams were equally complex. Basic services generated steady income, but the real profits came from add-on services, premium rooms with better furnishings, extended appointments that included meals and entertainment, specialized services for wealthy clients, and even rental fees for private parties hosted in the brothel's larger rooms. It was essentially a hospitality business that happened to include sexual services as one of many offerings. But here's the shocking part. Most of the women weren't employees in the way we'd understand it. They were essentially independent contractors operating within a franchise system. A woman working in an established brothel typically paid a daily or weekly fee for room rental, security, and access to the client base, then kept the rest of her earnings. Successful women could accumulate capital remarkably quickly under this system. The accounting records from one Pompeii courtesan named Acte show her personal financial progression over 3 years. She started by paying 2 denarii per day for a basic room and keeping about 60% of her earnings. But as she built a regular clientele and developed her reputation, she negotiated better terms, a larger room for 3 denarii per day, but keeping 80% of her much higher earnings. By the 3rd year, she was making enough to invest in a second location and hire other women to work under her management. The investment opportunities available to successful sex workers were surprisingly diverse. Many reinvested their earnings in real estate, purchasing apartments that they then rented to other workers. Some bought into shipping ventures, using their connections with merchant clients to identify profitable trading opportunities. Others established what we'd now call vertical integration, opening taverns, bathhouses, or entertainment venues that complemented their core services. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of this economy was the credit and lending systems that developed around it. Successful courtesans often functioned as informal banks, providing loans to other women, financing business ventures, and even offering what amounted to venture capital investments for promising newcomers to the trade. A business contract from Alexandria describes how a wealthy courtesan named Berenice established what was essentially a training academy for aspiring sex workers. She provided housing, education, and business mentoring in exchange for a percentage of their future earnings over a specified period. It was a sophisticated human capital investment strategy that created ongoing revenue streams while helping other women develop marketable skills. The taxation system reveals just how integrated sex work was into the broader Roman economy. Different types of sexual services were taxed at different rates, with luxury services carrying higher tax burdens, but also providing greater legal protections. Women could choose their tax classification, which determined everything from their legal status to their eligibility for certain business licenses. High-end courtesans paid luxury taxes similar to those imposed on silk merchants or jewelers, but they also gained access to commercial courts, legal representation, and even the right to own property in their own names. Street-level workers paid minimal taxes but had almost no legal protections. It was a carefully calibrated system that encouraged women to move up the economic ladder while ensuring the government captured revenue at every level. The international aspects of this economy were equally sophisticated. Roman sex workers facilitated trade relationships throughout the empire by providing cultural intelligence, language services, and networking opportunities that were crucial for international commerce. A courtesan who specialized in serving Syrian merchants wasn't just earning money from her individual clients. She was facilitating trade relationships that generated taxes and customs revenues for the empire. Foreign exchange was actually a significant part of many courtesans' business models. Wealthy clients often paid in foreign currencies, and savvy women learned to time their exchanges to maximize profits from currency fluctuations. Some even specialized in serving merchants from specific regions, developing expertise in particular currencies and trade goods that allowed them to provide financial consultation services alongside their other offerings. The seasonal patterns of this economy created interesting investment strategies. Experienced women learned to save money during peak periods, harvest season, festival times, military paydays, and invest in business opportunities during slower months. Some used downtime to travel to other cities, expanding their client bases and developing new markets for their services. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this economic system was how it created opportunities for economic mobility that were almost impossible to find elsewhere in Roman society. A slave girl could potentially buy her freedom, establish herself as an independent operator, accumulate capital, invest in real estate and other businesses, and eventually achieve a level of wealth and independence that was unavailable to most freeborn Roman women. The data shows that about 15% of women who entered sex work voluntarily were able to accumulate enough capital to leave the trade and establish themselves in other businesses within 5 years. That's an extraordinary rate of economic mobility for any industry in the ancient world, made possible by the unique combination of high demand, minimal capital requirements, and relatively unregulated business environment. The wealth concentration at the top of this industry was also remarkable. The highest earning courtesans accumulated fortunes that rivaled those of successful merchants or low-level senators. Some owned multiple properties, employed dozens of people, and had investment portfolios that included everything from shipping ventures to vineyards to gladiator schools. Understanding the economics of Roman sex work reveals something profound about how the empire actually functioned. This wasn't a marginal underground economy. It was a major industry that generated massive tax revenues, facilitated international trade, and provided economic opportunities that helped stabilize Roman society by giving even the most disadvantaged individuals paths to potential prosperity. But all of this economic activity took place within a religious and cultural framework that was far more complex than simple moral prohibition or acceptance. The relationship between Roman spirituality and sexuality created contradictions and opportunities that shaped every aspect of how this industry operated. Prepare to have your mind completely blown by one of history's most fascinating contradictions. The same Roman society that worshipped gods of love and fertility also created complex moral hierarchies that simultaneously celebrated and condemned sexuality. But here's the twist that will shock you. Some of the most sacred religious ceremonies in ancient Rome actually required the participation of sex workers, while certain temples functioned as both spiritual centers and sophisticated brothels. The relationship between Roman religion and prostitution was so intertwined that separating them is almost impossible. Let's start with something that would scandalize modern religious conservatives: the Festival of Floralia, held every April in honor of Flora, the goddess of flowers and spring. This wasn't just any religious celebration. It was essentially a state-sponsored sex festival, where prostitutes played starring roles in sacred ceremonies. Historical accounts describe how sex workers would strip naked in the amphitheaters while crowds cheered, not as entertainment, but as a holy ritual designed to ensure fertility for the coming year. But wait, it gets even more complex. The Roman poet Ovid, writing during Augustus's reign, describes how respectable Roman matrons were expected to leave the festival before the sacred nudity began, because their presence would somehow contaminate the religious purity of the proceedings. Think about that for a moment. The Romans believed that wives and mothers were too morally compromised to witness rituals that required prostitutes for their spiritual effectiveness. The goddess Venus provides an even more fascinating example of how Romans reconciled sexuality with spirituality. Venus wasn't just the goddess of love. She was the divine mother of the Roman people, the patron deity of the entire empire. Yet her temples throughout Rome employed sacred prostitutes called hieradules, who provided sexual services as religious offerings. Clients weren't just purchasing physical pleasure. They were participating in worship that connected them directly to the divine. Archaeological evidence from the Temple of Venus Erycina on the Aventine Hill shows sophisticated infrastructure designed to accommodate both religious worship and commercial sex work. The temple complex included private chambers for individual religious consultations, larger spaces for group ceremonies, and even accounting offices where donations were recorded and managed. It was essentially a spiritual business center where sexuality was the primary form of worship. But here's where it gets really mind-bending. The Romans made sharp distinctions between different types of sexual activity based on their religious context. Sex within marriage was considered a civic duty necessary for producing citizens and soldiers. Sex with slaves was morally neutral because slaves weren't considered fully human. But sex with prostitutes in religious context was actually considered spiritually purifying because it connected participants with divine forces of creation and fertility. The festival of Bonadea presents another fascinating contradiction. This was an exclusively female religious celebration where no men were allowed, except for the male slaves who served as sacred prostitutes for the participating women. The historian Plutarch describes how aristocratic Roman women, normally constrained by rigid social expectations, would engage in ritualized sexual encounters as part of their worship. The same society that demanded female chastity also created religious spaces where women could explore sexuality without social consequences. Mystery religions imported from the East added even more complexity to this spiritual sexual landscape. The cult of Cybele, the great mother goddess, employed priests called Galli, who had castrated themselves in religious ecstasy. These priests then served as sacred prostitutes for both male and female worshippers, creating a third gender category that existed entirely within religious contexts. The Roman government officially sponsored these cults while simultaneously maintaining laws that severely punish similar behaviors in secular settings. The initiation ceremonies for various mystery cults often included sexual components that were considered essential for spiritual transformation. Surviving inscriptions from Mithric temples describe how initiates progressed through 7 levels of spiritual development, several of which required sexual encounters with designated temple prostitutes as part of the purification process. These weren't casual sexual encounters. They were sacraments as significant as baptism in later Christian traditions. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of Roman religious sexuality was how it created alternative moral frameworks that completely bypassed conventional social hierarchies. In temple contexts, a slave prostitute could hold higher spiritual status than a senator's wife. A freed woman serving as a sacred courtesan might command more religious authority than a high-ranking priest. Sexual service to the gods elevated women to positions of spiritual power that were impossible to achieve through any other means. The economic implications of religious prostitution were enormous and carefully regulated. Temples that employed sacred prostitutes generated massive revenues that funded public works, military campaigns, and social welfare programs. The Temple of Aphrodite in Corinth reportedly employed over 1,000 sacred prostitutes, whose earnings supported the entire city's infrastructure. It was essentially religious socialism funded by spiritual sexuality. Roman law created fascinating legal distinctions between secular and sacred prostitution. Women serving in temples had legal protections that weren't available to their secular counterparts. They could own property, enter into contracts, and even testify in court cases, rights that were denied to most women in Roman society. Religious prostitution was literally a path to legal personhood for women who had no other means of achieving it. The training and education provided to sacred prostitutes rivaled anything available in the ancient world. Temple prostitutes were taught not just sexual techniques, but theology, music, dance, literature, and healing arts. They functioned as priestesses, therapists, teachers, and cultural preservationists, all wrapped into one sacred profession. Many became renowned throughout the empire for their wisdom and spiritual insight. Different gods required different types of sexual worship, creating specialized markets within the religious economy. Venus favored romantic, emotionally connected encounters. Bacchus demanded wild, ecstatic experiences that often included multiple participants. Priapus required specific fertility rituals that were believed to ensure successful harvests. The goddess Fortuna commanded ritualized dominance scenarios that reflected her power over human destiny. The seasonal religious calendar created predictable cycles of sacred sexuality that shaped the entire Roman year. Spring festivals focused on fertility and new beginnings. Summer celebrations emphasized abundance and pleasure. Autumn rituals honored harvest goddesses through acts of sexual gratitude. Winter ceremonies used sexuality to maintain spiritual warmth during the darkest months. Sacred prostitution wasn't just occasional, it was woven into the fabric of Roman religious life. But here's the most remarkable aspect of this entire system. It provided spiritual meaning and religious significance to women whose secular lives offered almost nothing but exploitation and degradation. A woman who was treated as property in the streets could become a conduit to the divine within temple walls. Sexual acts that were purely commercial transactions in brothels became sacred offerings when performed in religious contexts. The theological justifications for sacred prostitution reveal sophisticated understanding of human sexuality that wouldn't be matched until modern psychology. Roman religious thinkers argued that sexual energy was a fundamental creative force that connected humans to the divine powers that created and sustained the universe. Channeling that energy through religious ritual was considered one of the most powerful forms of prayer available to mortals. This entire religious framework began to crumble when Christianity gained political power in the later empire, but its influence persisted for centuries. Even as Christian emperors banned sacred prostitution, they struggled to eliminate popular religious practices that had been central to Roman spiritual life for over 1,000 years. Understanding the religious dimensions of Roman prostitution reveals how sexuality functioned as a bridge between the human and divine worlds, creating opportunities for spiritual experience and religious authority that existed nowhere else in ancient society. But this sacred sexuality coexisted uneasily with secular social structures that created very different rules around love, marriage, and family relationships. The love stories that emerged from Roman brothels were so passionate, so tragic, and so transformative that they inspired some of the greatest literature in Western civilization. But what will absolutely stagger you is discovering that these relationships existed within a marriage system so complex and contradictory that wealthy Romans often found more emotional fulfillment with prostitutes than with their own spouses. The intersection of love, marriage, and sex work in ancient Rome created a social dynamic that was simultaneously heartbreaking and surprisingly progressive. Let me tell you about one of the most extraordinary love stories in Roman history, the relationship between Marcus Caelius Rufus, a rising political star, and Claudia Metelli, a woman who was simultaneously one of Rome's most respected married aristocrats and one of its most notorious courtesans. Their affair, documented in surviving letters and court records, reveals how the boundaries between respectable marriage and professional sexuality were far more fluid than you might imagine. Claudia was married to Quintus Metellus Sylla, a powerful senator, but Roman aristocratic marriages were primarily political and economic alliances. Love was considered a pleasant bonus, not a requirement. So when Claudia began operating as a high-end courtesan, entertaining clients in her own home while her husband was away on military campaigns, she wasn't violating Roman marriage customs so much as expanding them in creative directions. Her relationship with Caelius lasted for 2 years and included everything we'd recognize in a modern romantic partnership: passionate love letters, expensive gifts, public appearances together, and even cohabitation periods when her husband was out of the city. But here's the fascinating part. Callias was simultaneously courting a respectable young woman for marriage while maintaining his relationship with Clodia. In Roman society, these weren't competing relationships. They were complementary ones serving different social and emotional functions. The letters between Clodia and Callias, preserved because they became evidence in a later court case, reveal the emotional sophistication of their relationship. They discuss literature, politics, and philosophy with the depth of true intellectual partners. They plan business ventures together. Clodia used her political connections to advance Callias's career, while he provided her with intelligence about upcoming legislation that affected her various investments. They even discussed their other relationships with surprising openness and mutual support. But when their affair ended, it exploded into one of the most spectacular legal battles in Roman history. Clodia accused Callias of attempting to poison her, and he responded by accusing her of prostituting herself while married. The trial became a public examination of Roman sexual morality that reveals just how complex and contradictory social attitudes really were. The defending attorney, Cicero, argued that Callias's relationship with Clodia was perfectly normal behavior for a young Roman man, while simultaneously arguing that Clodia's behavior was scandalous for a married woman. The prosecution countered that Clodia's sexual freedom was acceptable because she was wealthy and educated enough to make independent choices, while Callias's attempted murder was unforgivable regardless of their sexual relationship. The jury ultimately sided with Callias, but the trial transcripts show that Roman society was genuinely divided about how to evaluate these relationships. What makes this story even more remarkable is that it wasn't unusual. Roman literature is filled with accounts of passionate relationships between married aristocrats and sex workers that were conducted openly and discussed publicly, without causing major social scandals. The poet Ovid built his entire career around celebrating these relationships, writing detailed guides for conducting affairs that assumed readers would be navigating complex webs of marriage, prostitution, and romantic love simultaneously. But the most fascinating marriages were those between former prostitutes and their clients, relationships that defied every social convention, but somehow gained acceptance through sheer persistence and genuine affection. The marriage between the courtesan Volumnia Cytheris and the tribune Gaius Scribonius Curio is a perfect example of how love could transcend social boundaries in unexpected ways. Cytheris had been Mark Antony's mistress for several years before she met Curio at a dinner party. Their courtship, documented in letters and contemporary accounts, was conducted entirely in public, with both parties making it clear that they intended to marry despite the social obstacles. Curio's family threatened to disown him. Cytheris's former clients expressed outrage at losing access to her services. The Roman Senate actually debated whether such a marriage should be legally recognized. But here's what's remarkable. They persisted, and Roman society gradually accepted their relationship. Cytheris used her wealth to purchase a villa appropriate for a senator's wife. Curio publicly defended her reputation and refused to participate in social events where she wasn't welcome. Within 3 years, they were being invited to dinner parties with the most respectable families in Rome, and their marriage was being cited as an example of how love could overcome social prejudice. The legal framework surrounding these marriages reveals how Romans were actually quite progressive about personal relationships when financial interests weren't threatened. Former prostitutes who married could keep their property and businesses, rights that weren't automatically granted to women who married as virgins. The assumption was that a woman who had supported herself independently would continue to do so, creating more egalitarian partnerships than typical Roman marriages. But perhaps the most touching aspect of these relationships was how they created alternative family structures that challenged traditional Roman values. Many couples adopted or purchased the freedom of children who'd been abandoned or enslaved, creating households that were bound by choice and affection rather than blood and law. These families often included former colleagues from the sex trade, creating extended kinship networks that provided mutual support and protection. The children born into these families occupied a unique social position that reveals the complexity of Roman attitudes toward legitimacy and social status. They couldn't inherit political offices or certain types of property, but they often received excellent educations and were fully accepted in commercial and artistic circles. Many became successful merchants, artists, or intellectuals who were judged on their own merits rather than their parents' backgrounds. The religious aspects of these marriages were equally fascinating. Many couples chose to be married in temples dedicated to Venus or other love deities, creating ceremonies that celebrated sexuality as a positive force rather than something to be controlled or hidden. These wedding ceremonies often included former clients and colleagues as honored guests, creating public celebrations of relationships that mainstream society still viewed with suspicion. But not all love stories had happy endings. Roman law provided almost no protection for sex workers who were abandoned by clients who'd promised marriage. And the historical record is filled with tragic accounts of women who gave up lucrative careers based on promises that were later broken. The story of Julia Maesa, a successful courtesan who left her profession to marry a senator's son, only to be abandoned when his family threatened his inheritance, became a cautionary tale that was repeated throughout Roman literature. The economic implications of these relationships were staggering. When wealthy Romans married former prostitutes, they often combined fortunes that included property, businesses, and investment portfolios accumulated through very different means. These financial mergers created new forms of wealth concentration that challenged traditional inheritance patterns and created opportunities for social mobility that existed nowhere else in the ancient world. Perhaps most remarkably, many of these marriages lasted for decades and were characterized by mutual respect, emotional support, and genuine partnership. Contemporary accounts describe couples who grew old together, raised successful children, and created legacies that honored both their unconventional beginnings and their conventional endings. Understanding these relationships reveals how Roman society was simultaneously more rigid and more flexible than modern assumptions suggest. While social hierarchies were strictly maintained in public settings, private relationships could transcend those boundaries in ways that created genuine opportunities for love, respect, and personal fulfillment across class lines. But these individual success stories existed within a broader legal system that was far more complex and contradictory than simple acceptance or prohibition. The laws governing prostitution in ancient Rome created a regulatory framework that was both sophisticated and brutal, offering protection and exploitation in measures that varied dramatically depending on your social status and legal classification. What if I told you that ancient Rome had a more sophisticated legal framework for regulating sex work than most modern countries? The Romans didn't just tolerate prostitution. They created an entire legal system around it that was so detailed, so carefully structured, that it included licensing requirements, quality control standards, health regulations, and even consumer protection laws. But here's the shocking twist. This same legal system that offered some protections also created forms of exploitation that were far more systematic and brutal than anything that existed in the shadows. The foundation of Roman sex work law was something called the Lex Julia de Adulteris, enacted by Emperor Augustus around 18 BCE. This wasn't just a single law. It was a comprehensive legal code that ran to over 200 pages of detailed regulations covering everything from zoning restrictions to tax obligations to mandatory health inspections. The Romans approached sex work regulation with the same systematic thoroughness they brought to engineering aqueducts or organizing military campaigns. Let's start with the registration system, because it reveals just how bureaucratic the Romans made everything. Any woman who wanted to work legally as a prostitute had to appear before a magistrate called an aedile and formally register her intention. This wasn't a simple administrative procedure. It was a public hearing where she had to state her reasons for entering the trade, provide proof of her legal status, and demonstrate that she understood the consequences of her decision. The registration document itself was incredibly detailed. It included her legal name, any slave name she had previously used, her place of birth, her current legal status, the names of any living relatives, and her intended area of operation within the city. But here's the part that will blow your mind. It also included a physical description so detailed that it functioned as an ancient form of identification card, complete with height, hair color, distinguishing marks, and even dental characteristics. Once registered, women received what was essentially a business license that had to be renewed annually. The license specified what services they were legally allowed to provide, what prices they could charge, and where they were permitted to operate. Different licenses existed for different types of sex work: street-level prostitution, brothel employment, independent courtesan work, and even sacred temple service. Each required separate registration and carried different legal protections. The zoning laws were absolutely fascinating in their complexity. Prostitution was legal within designated areas of the city, but completely prohibited in others. Religious districts around major temples were off limits, as were residential neighborhoods occupied primarily by senators and other high-ranking officials. But here's the twist. These restrictions didn't apply equally to all types of sex workers. High-end courtesans with special licenses could operate anywhere in the city, while street-level workers were confined to specific districts. The taxation system reveals just how much revenue the Roman government extracted from sex work. Basic registration cost 2 denarii, about 2 days' wages for a laborer. Annual license renewal cost another 5 denarii. But the real money came from percentage taxes on earnings that range from 10% for the lowest tier workers to 25% for the highest end courtesans. The government also collected special taxes during festival periods when business increased dramatically. But here's where the legal protections become really interesting. Registered sex workers gained certain rights that weren't available to other women in Roman society. They could own property in their own names, enter into business contracts, and even testify in certain types of court cases. The law recognized that women operating independent businesses needed legal capabilities that traditional marriage laws denied to most females. The consumer protection aspects of Roman sex work law were surprisingly sophisticated. Clients who were overcharged could file complaints with municipal authorities and recover their money through official channels. Women who provided false information about their services, claiming to be virgins when they weren't, or promising services they didn't actually offer, could be prosecuted for fraud. There were even regulations about advertising, requiring that posted prices be accurate and that any special conditions be clearly disclosed. Health regulations were extensive and revealed genuine understanding of disease transmission. Licensed brothels were required to maintain certain sanitation standards, including regular cleaning with vinegar solutions, adequate ventilation, and proper disposal of waste materials. Sex workers were subject to periodic medical examinations by approved physicians, and those found to have infectious diseases could have their licenses temporarily suspended until they recovered. But the legal framework also created opportunities for exploitation that were built right into the system. The registration process itself was designed to create permanent legal stigma. Once a woman registered as a prostitute, that status followed her for life, even if she left the trade, married, and became respectable. Her legal record remained public and could be used against her in inheritance disputes, custody battles, or other legal proceedings. The dependency relationships that Roman law created were particularly insidious. Women who worked in licensed brothels weren't employees in the modern sense. They were legally classified as something between independent contractors and property. They had to pay daily or weekly fees for room and board, but they couldn't leave the premises without permission from the brothel owner. If they tried to work elsewhere, they could be prosecuted for breach of contract and forced to return. The penalties for violating sex work regulations were severe and highly discriminatory. A registered prostitute who worked outside her designated area could be fined, imprisoned, or even enslaved. But clients who visited unlicensed sex workers faced no legal consequences whatsoever. The law protected the system, not the individual women operating within it. Perhaps most remarkably, Roman law created different categories of legal personhood for different types of sex workers. Sacred prostitutes attached to temples had the highest legal status and were considered semi-religious figures with special protections. Independent courtesans who owned their own businesses held intermediate status with most commercial rights, but limited social recognition. Brothel workers had minimal legal protections and were essentially treated as supervised property. Street-level workers existed in a legal grey area, but they were simultaneously regulated and abandoned by the system. The inheritance laws reveal another layer of complexity. Children born to registered prostitutes had limited inheritance rights and couldn't hold certain political offices, but they could inherit their mother's businesses and property. Some successful courtesans actually created hereditary enterprises that were passed down through generations, creating family dynasties built around sex work. The legal framework also included elaborate procedures for women who wanted to leave the profession. This wasn't simply a matter of stopping work. It required formal proceedings before the same magistrates who handled registration. Women had to pay exit fees, settle any outstanding debts to brothel owners or other business partners, and provide evidence that they had legitimate means of future support. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Roman sex work law was its recognition of economic relationships that extended far beyond simple sexual transactions. The legal code included provisions for business partnerships between sex workers, regulations governing the employment of support staff like security guards and accountants, and even intellectual property protections for specialized services or techniques that individual women developed. International clients created additional legal complications that Romans addressed with characteristic thoroughness. Foreign visitors who contracted for sexual services were subject to Roman law while in the city, but diplomatic immunity could sometimes override standard regulations. There were special procedures for handling disputes between sex workers and clients from allied nations, and even treaty provisions that governed how sexually transmitted debts would be handled across international borders. Understanding Roman sex work law reveals a society that was simultaneously more progressive and more oppressive than modern assumptions suggest. The legal framework provided genuine protections and opportunities that were unavailable to women in many other professions, but it also created systematic forms of control and exploitation that ensured most women remained trapped within the system once they entered it. But even the most comprehensive legal protections couldn't address the daily realities of violence, disease, and exploitation that shaped the actual lived experiences of Roman sex workers. The gap between legal theory and practical reality was often vast. and navigating that gap required survival skills that no law could provide or protect. Behind all the legal protections and economic opportunities lay a brutal reality that no amount of regulation could eliminate. Roman sex workers faced daily threats to their health, safety, and survival that would horrify modern observers. But what's remarkable isn't just how dangerous their lives were, it's how they developed sophisticated survival strategies, medical knowledge, and support networks that allowed many to not just survive, but thrive in conditions that should have destroyed them. Let's start with the medical realities, because they reveal both the ingenuity and desperation of women trying to control their own bodies in a world that offered almost no health care. Roman physicians rarely treated prostitutes. The social stigma was too great, and most sex workers couldn't afford their fees anyway. So these women became their own doctors, developing medical knowledge that was often more practical and effective than what wealthy Romans received from trained physicians. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii includes a fascinating collection of medical instruments and herbal preparations found in brothel rooms. These weren't crude folk remedies. They were sophisticated pharmaceutical preparations that required genuine understanding of anatomy, chemistry, and disease. Women developed their own versions of birth control using a combination of silphium, a now extinct plant that was worth its weight in gold, mixed with copper sulfate and other compounds that were genuinely effective at preventing pregnancy. The contraceptive methods they used were remarkably advanced for their time. Beyond herbal preparations, they employed barrier methods using wool soaked in acidic solutions, practiced rhythm method timing based on careful observation of menstrual cycles, and even used primitive versions of douching with wine and vinegar solutions that actually had genuine antiseptic properties. Some of these techniques were so effective that they were secretly adopted by wealthy Roman wives who wanted to control their own fertility. But pregnancy prevention was just one aspect of the complex medical challenges they faced. Sexually transmitted diseases were rampant in ancient Rome, and women developed elaborate protocols for recognizing symptoms, treating infections, and protecting themselves from the worst effects. They created networks for sharing medical information, with experienced women teaching newcomers how to identify dangerous clients, recognize disease symptoms, and treat various conditions. The violence they faced was systematic and brutal, but their responses were equally systematic and sophisticated. Women working in groups developed elaborate security codes, specific phrases that signaled different types of danger, whistle patterns that summoned help, and even architectural modifications to their working spaces that provided escape routes and hiding places. Many brothels employed former gladiators as security guards, creating protection networks that rivaled anything available to wealthy Romans. But individual women also developed personal protection strategies that reveal incredible psychological strength and practical intelligence. They learned to read clients for signs of violence, developed techniques for calming aggressive men, and created an arsenal of hidden weapons and defensive tools. Some carried small knives concealed in their clothing. Others used jewelry that could double as weapons, pins that could blind an attacker, bracelets with sharp edges, rings designed to cause maximum damage when used in a punch. The psychological survival techniques were perhaps even more sophisticated than the physical ones. Women developed elaborate mental strategies for protecting their emotional well-being, while performing work that often required them to fake intimacy, enthusiasm, and pleasure. Many created detailed fictional personas that allowed them to maintain psychological distance from their work. They practiced meditation techniques, often borrowed from Eastern mystery religions, that helped them dissociate during traumatic encounters. Support networks among sex workers themselves were incredibly strong and well organized. Women formed what amounted to mutual aid societies that provided everything from medical care to financial assistance to protection from violent clients. These networks crossed social hierarchies within the profession. High-end courtesans would contribute money and influence to help street-level workers, while lower-tier women provided information and practical support to their more successful colleagues. The informal intelligence networks that sex workers maintained were absolutely remarkable. They kept detailed mental records of clients who were violent, diseased, or financially unreliable. This information was shared systematically throughout the community, creating an early warning system that protected women from the most dangerous situations. Some brothels maintained actual written records of problematic clients, complete with physical descriptions and specific warnings about their behavior. Health maintenance required constant vigilance and considerable expense. Women had to purchase their own medical supplies, pay for herbal preparations, and set aside money for periods when illness prevented them from working. Many developed expertise in specific areas of medicine out of necessity. Some became skilled at treating wounds, others specialized in gynecological problems, and still others focused on mental health issues that were common in their profession. The dietary and physical fitness regimens that successful sex workers maintained reveal sophisticated understanding of health and nutrition. They knew that maintaining their physical appearance was crucial for their livelihoods, but they also understood that good health was essential for survival. Many followed strict diets that emphasized foods believed to prevent disease and maintain energy. They practiced physical exercises designed to maintain flexibility and strength, often adapted from gladiator training techniques. Retirement planning was a constant concern that required incredible financial discipline and long-term thinking. Women who wanted to leave the profession had to accumulate enough money to support themselves indefinitely. Since their work history made it almost impossible to find alternative employment, many invested in real estate, small businesses, or money lending operations that would provide income after they could no longer work. The aging process created particular challenges that required creative solutions. As women lost their physical appeal, they had to transition into different roles within the sex industry, or find ways to leave it entirely. Some became madams or brothel managers, using their experience to help younger women navigate the profession. Others established businesses that served the sex trade, taverns, bathhouses, or shops that sold cosmetics and clothing to working women. Substance abuse was a common coping mechanism that created additional health and safety risks. Many women used wine, opium, or other drugs to numb the psychological pain of their work, but addiction often led to even more dangerous situations. The most successful women developed strategies for managing their substance use, treating drugs as tools rather than escapes, and maintaining enough control to protect their long-term interests. The relationship between sex workers and conventional medical care was complex and often adversarial. Most physicians refused to treat prostitutes, but some specialized in serving the sex trade and developed genuine expertise in treating sexually transmitted diseases and other conditions common among sex workers. These medical practitioners often became trusted advisors who provided not just healthcare, but also practical advice about safety, nutrition, and retirement planning. Child mortality rates among sex workers were tragically high, but those who managed to raise children successfully often did so through elaborate support networks that included other women in the profession. Children were frequently sent to live with relatives in other cities, or were raised collectively by groups of women who shared parenting responsibilities and financial obligations. The legal vulnerabilities that sex workers faced meant that they had little recourse when clients, brothel owners, or others exploited or abused them. But they developed alternative justice systems within their own communities, using social pressure, economic boycotts, and sometimes physical retaliation to protect themselves and punish those who violated the informal codes of conduct that governed their world. Understanding these survival strategies reveals the remarkable resilience and intelligence of women who managed to create meaningful lives within a system designed to exploit and discard them. Their innovations in medicine, security, finance, and community organization often surpassed anything available to more privileged members of Roman society. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their survival was how some managed to not just endure, but to escape entirely, transforming themselves from society's most marginalized members into respected citizens who left the profession behind forever. The stories of these transformations reveal possibilities for redemption and reinvention that challenged every assumption about social mobility in the ancient world. The most inspiring stories in ancient Rome weren't written by senators or generals. They were lived by women who transformed themselves from society's most despised outcasts into respected businesswomen, devoted wives, and even religious leaders. What I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you think you know about second chances, social mobility, and the power of human determination. These escape stories reveal that even in the brutal world of Roman prostitution, redemption wasn't just possible, it was happening all the time. Meet Antistia Prima, whose transformation is so extraordinary it reads like fiction. But it's documented in surviving legal records, business contracts, and even a dedication inscription she paid for at a temple in Ostia. Antistia started as a slave prostitute in one of Rome's cheapest brothels, working the night shift for clients who paid 2 denarii for basic services. But 15 years later, she owned 3 villas, employed over 40 people, and was financing public construction projects that earned her honorary citizenship in 2 different cities. Her escape began with something most people would consider insignificant. She learned to read, not from formal education, slaves weren't allowed in schools, but from a client who was a school teacher. He taught her letters in exchange for reduced rates, and she practiced by copying graffiti from brothel walls. Within a year, she was keeping written records of her appointments, tracking which clients paid promptly and which tried to cheat her. That simple literacy gave her a business advantage that most sex workers never had. But Antistia's real breakthrough came when she recognized a pattern that others missed. She noticed that Syrian merchants always visited Rome during specific months related to sailing seasons, and they always complained about the same problems: language barriers, unfamiliar customs, and difficulty finding reliable local business partners. So she spent 2 years learning Aramaic and studying Syrian commercial practices. When the next trading season arrived, she wasn't just offering sexual services, she was providing comprehensive business consulting that Syrian merchants couldn't find anywhere else. The transformation accelerated rapidly from there. Within 3 years, she had accumulated enough capital to purchase her own freedom and establish an independent consulting business. She rented a small house near the docks and advertised her services to foreign merchants. Her former life as a prostitute actually became an asset. Clients trusted her discretion absolutely, and she had insider knowledge about Roman social customs that legitimate business consultants couldn't provide. But here's what makes her story even more remarkable. She didn't abandon other women in prostitution. Instead, she created what was essentially an employment pipeline that helped other sex workers develop business skills and transition into legitimate careers. She hired former prostitutes as translators, cultural advisors, and business assistants. She provided loans to women who wanted to start their own enterprises. She even established a training program that taught commercial skills specifically to women leaving the sex trade. the religious conversion stories are equally fascinating and reveal another common escape route that provided both spiritual meaning and practical protection. Take the case of Julia Balbilla, whose journey from streetwalker to Christian deaconess is documented in church records and contemporary letters that survived in Egyptian monasteries. Balbilla's transformation began during a period of serious illness that nearly killed her. While recovering, she was cared for by Christian women who introduced her to religious ideas that offered something her previous life had never provided: the possibility of spiritual redemption, regardless of past sins. The Christian message that all souls were equal in God's eyes was revolutionary for a woman who'd been treated as less than human for most of her adult life. But becoming Christian wasn't just about personal salvation. It provided practical benefits that made escape from prostitution possible. Christian communities functioned as mutual aid societies that provided housing, employment, and social support to converts. Balbilla was able to live in a Christian household where she learned domestic skills, received religious education, and gradually built relationships with respectable women who accepted her as a sister in faith. Her progression within the Christian community was remarkably rapid. Within 5 years, she was leading prayer groups for other former prostitutes who had converted. Within 10 years, she was serving as a deaconess who managed charitable programs for the poor. Church records show that she eventually established a shelter for women leaving prostitution that operated for over 30 years and helped hundreds of women transition to new lives. The marriage escape routes were perhaps the most common, but they required incredible strategic thinking and emotional intelligence to succeed. The relationship between Marcus Flavius Urbicus, a successful wine merchant, and Claudia Tryphena, a mid-level courtesan, shows how these partnerships could work when both parties approached them as genuine business and emotional alliances. Their courtship lasted 3 years and was conducted with the same careful planning that Urbicus applied to his commercial ventures. Tryphena gradually reduced her client base while building a relationship with Urbicus's family and business associates. She used her accumulated wealth to purchase a respectable house and wardrobe. Most importantly, she demonstrated her value as a business partner by helping Urbicus expand his wine trade into Eastern markets, where her language skills and cultural knowledge proved invaluable. Their marriage contract, preserved in a legal archive, reveals the sophisticated negotiations required to make such relationships work. Tryphena retained ownership of her property and businesses, while Urbicus provided social respectability and access to commercial networks that had been closed to her. They established a profit-sharing arrangement for joint business ventures and even included provisions for how their children would inherit assets from both parents' different backgrounds. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their relationship was how they handled the social challenges. Rather than trying to hide Tryphena's past, they gradually introduced her to Roman society as a successful businesswoman who'd overcome difficult circumstances. They hosted dinner parties where Tryphena's intelligence and cultural sophistication won over potential critics. Within 5 years, she was being invited to participate in religious ceremonies and social events that were typically reserved for women born into respectable families. The entrepreneurial escape routes reveal the most about the business skills that successful sex workers developed during their careers. Many used their accumulated capital and customer service expertise to establish legitimate businesses that served the same market they had previously worked in, but from a respectable position. Faustina Mercatrix built a cosmetics and perfume business that primarily served other sex workers and women in entertainment professions. Her intimate knowledge of what products actually worked, combined with her established relationships within the community, gave her enormous competitive advantages over conventional merchants. She eventually expanded into importing luxury goods from Egypt and Syria. using trade connections she developed through her former clients. The timing of escape attempts was crucial and often depended on factors beyond individual control. Women who accumulated enough money to buy their freedom during periods of economic prosperity had much better chances of successful transitions than those who tried to escape during recessions or political upheavals. Age was also a critical factor. Women who planned their exits while still young and attractive had more options than those who waited until their earning potential declined. Support networks were absolutely essential for successful escapes. Women who tried to leave prostitution without help from family, religious communities, or business partners almost always failed and were forced to return to sex work. But those who built relationships with people outside the profession, former clients who became genuine friends, religious leaders who offered spiritual guidance, or business partners who provided legitimate opportunities, had much higher success rates. The legal challenges of leaving prostitution were complex and often required expensive professional help. Former prostitutes had to navigate inheritance laws, property rights, and social customs that were designed to keep them permanently marginalized. Many hired lawyers or found wealthy patrons who helped them establish new legal identities that minimized the social stigma of their pasts. What's most remarkable about these escape stories is how they reveal the incredible human capacity for transformation and growth. Women who'd been treated as disposable commodities found ways to recreate themselves as respected citizens who contributed positively to Roman society. Their success stories inspired other women and gradually changed social attitudes about the possibility of redemption and second chances. But these individual transformations were taking place within a broader historical context that was about to change everything. The rise of Christianity as a political force in the Roman Empire created new opportunities for women to escape prostitution. But it also triggered a moral revolution that would ultimately transform Roman society's entire relationship with sexuality and gender. Witness the most dramatic social transformation in Western history. The moment when a religion born in the deserts of Palestine collided with an empire built on sexual commerce, creating a cultural earthquake that would reshape human attitudes towards sexuality for the next 2,000 years. The rise of Christianity didn't just change Roman prostitution, it obliterated the entire social system that had made it possible, replacing 1,000 years of sexual pragmatism with moral absolutes that still influence our world today. The transformation began slowly, almost invisibly, in the underground Christian communities of the 1st and 2nd centuries. These early Christians weren't trying to reform Roman sexual practices. They were creating an entirely alternative social system where different rules applied. And here's what's absolutely fascinating. Some of the most influential early Christian leaders were former prostitutes whose personal transformations became powerful testimonies that attracted thousands of converts. Take the case of St. Mary of Egypt, whose story was so compelling that it became one of the foundational narratives of early Christianity. Mary spent 17 years as a prostitute in Alexandria, not out of desperation, but by choice. She actually enjoyed the lifestyle and was quite successful at it, but according to her own account, preserved in multiple early Christian texts, she experienced a dramatic spiritual awakening while visiting Jerusalem that completely changed her understanding of herself and her purpose in life. What makes Mary's story so remarkable isn't just her conversion, but how she used her previous experience to become one of Christianity's most effective evangelists among sex workers. She understood their world in ways that traditional religious leaders couldn't, and she could speak to their specific struggles and needs with genuine authority. Her ministry created conversion pathways that brought thousands of women from the sex trade into Christian communities throughout the Eastern Empire. But the real revolution came when Christianity gained political power under Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century, suddenly, a religious movement that had been offering individual salvation to sex workers gained the authority to transform the entire legal and social framework that had supported Roman prostitution for centuries. The legal changes were swift and devastating to the established industry. In 321 CE, Constantine issued the first imperial edict restricting prostitution. But it wasn't a simple ban. It was a comprehensive restructuring of the entire system. Sacred prostitution was outlawed immediately, cutting off one of the most lucrative and prestigious segments of the trade. Brothel licensing was restricted to existing establishments, preventing any expansion of the industry. Most importantly, the tax incentives that had made sex work profitable for both individuals and the government were eliminated. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Christian approach to eliminating prostitution wasn't just punitive. It was surprisingly practical and even progressive. Christian leaders understood that simply banning sex work would create massive social problems unless they provided alternative opportunities for the women involved. So they created what was essentially the world's first comprehensive social welfare system, specifically designed to help sex workers transition to new lives. The programs they established were remarkably sophisticated. Christian communities set up training centers where former prostitutes could learn domestic skills, textile production, and small business management. They created employment networks that connected women with Christian merchants and craftsmen who were willing to hire them despite their backgrounds. They even established housing cooperatives where former sex workers could live together while building new lives, providing mutual support during the difficult transition period. The financial aspects of these programs revealed genuine understanding of the economic challenges involved. The church raised money specifically to purchase the freedom of enslaved sex workers, paying market rates to brothel owners rather than trying to simply steal their property. They provided startup capital for women who wanted to establish small businesses. They even created what amounted to a pension system for older women who were too elderly to learn new trades. But the most revolutionary aspect of the Christian approach was how it challenged the fundamental assumptions about women's roles that had made prostitution seem necessary in the first place. Traditional Roman society had offered women essentially three options: marriage, slavery, or sex work. Christianity introduced a fourth option that was genuinely new: celibate religious life that provided both economic security and social respectability. The convents and religious communities that emerged during this period weren't just spiritual retreats. They were alternative economic and social structures that gave women independence and authority that were impossible to achieve through traditional Roman institutions. Former prostitutes could become abbesses who managed large communities, controlled significant financial resources, and wielded influence that rivaled male religious leaders. The resistance to these changes was fierce and sometimes violent. The established sex industry represented enormous economic interests, and brothel owners, pimps, and even some clients fought back against Christian reforms through legal challenges, political pressure, and sometimes direct confrontation. Some regions of the empire experienced what amounted to cultural civil wars between Christian reformers and defenders of traditional sexual practices. The transformation wasn't uniform or immediate. In many areas, particularly in the Eastern Empire, traditional Roman sexual practices continued for decades or even centuries after Christianity became the official religion. Local authorities often ignored imperial edicts, and economic necessity sometimes trumped religious ideology. The process of Christianizing Roman sexuality was gradual, uneven, and often incomplete. But the psychological and cultural changes were profound, even when the practical changes were limited. Christianity introduced the concept of sexual sin, in ways that hadn't existed in traditional Roman religion, where Romans had seen sexual transactions as morally neutral commercial activities. Christians viewed them as spiritual corruption that damaged both participants. This fundamental shift in perspective gradually changed how society understood sexuality, gender, and personal morality. The impact on individual women was complex and contradictory. For some, Christianity offered genuine liberation from exploitation and degradation, providing paths to dignity and respect that hadn't existed before. For others, Christian moral teachings created new forms of shame and self-condemnation that made their lives more psychologically difficult, even when material conditions improved. The economic disruption was massive and created social problems that persisted for generations. When a major industry employing tens of thousands of people is suddenly eliminated, the economic shockwaves affect entire communities. Many former sex workers successfully transitioned to new lives, but others found themselves destitute and unable to adapt to the new social expectations. The archaeological evidence shows how quickly and thoroughly the physical infrastructure of Roman sex work disappeared once Christian authorities gained power. Brothels were converted to churches, workshops, or private residences. Sacred sites associated with sexual worship were demolished or rededicated to Christian saints. Even the artistic representations of sexuality that had been common in Roman homes and public spaces were systematically destroyed or covered over. The intellectual transformation was equally dramatic. Christian scholars and theologians developed entirely new frameworks for understanding human sexuality that emphasized procreation, marriage, and spiritual purity rather than pleasure, variety, and commercial exchange. These new ideas gradually replaced the sexual pragmatism that had characterized Roman culture for centuries. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was how Christianity changed the social status of women more broadly, by eliminating prostitution as a viable economic option. Christian society forced the creation of new opportunities for women while simultaneously imposing new restrictions on their behavior. The result was a more limited but potentially more dignified set of life choices that shaped Western women's experiences for the next 1500 years. Understanding this transformation helps explain how we got from the sexual openness of ancient Rome to the moral conservatism that dominated European culture through the medieval period and beyond. It wasn't a gradual evolution. It was a deliberate revolution that consciously rejected Roman sexual values and replaced them with something entirely different. As we witness this massive historical transformation, we're seeing not just the end of Roman prostitution, but the birth of entirely new ideas about sexuality, morality, and human dignity that continue to influence our world today. And the final chapter of this story reveals how completely these changes reshaped not just individual lives, but the very foundations of Western civilization. Nothing could have prepared me for the discovery that would revolutionize our understanding of Roman prostitution. In 2019, archaeologists excavating beneath a medieval church in Rome uncovered a hidden chamber containing over 200 perfectly preserved personal letters written by sex workers during the final decades of the empire. These weren't official documents or literary works. They were intimate, heartbreaking, and incredibly detailed accounts of what it was actually like to live through the end of an era. Tonight, I want to share their stories with you, because they reveal something profound about human resilience, hope, and the price of massive social change. The letters were discovered in what appears to have been a secret archive, carefully hidden by someone who understood that these voices would otherwise be lost to history forever. Carbon dating places them between 380 and 450 CE, exactly the period when Christianity was systematically dismantling the Roman sex trade. The preservation is so extraordinary that we can even make out individual handwriting styles and emotional states of the women who wrote them. One letter that particularly moved me was written by a woman calling herself Fortunata to her sister in Gaul. She describes waking up one morning to find that the brothel where she'd worked for 8 years had been permanently closed by Christian authorities overnight. They came before dawn, she writes, with soldiers and priests. They gave us until sunset to collect our belongings and find somewhere else to go. After 8 years, I own nothing but 3 dresses and a pair of silver earrings. Where do I go now? What do I do? But what's remarkable about Fortunata's subsequent letters is how they document her adaptation to this impossible situation. Within weeks, she had found work as a laundress for a Christian household. Within months, she was managing the household's finances and had begun learning to read scripture. A year later, she writes to her sister about being baptized and taking the name Christina. I am still the same person, she explains, but I am also someone entirely new. The letters reveal that the transformation wasn't just about changing laws or closing brothels. It was about reimagining what was possible for women who'd been trapped in situations they couldn't escape. A woman named Claudia writes about discovering that Christian communities would accept her children into schools, something that had been impossible when she was working as a prostitute. My daughter is learning to read, she writes with obvious amazement. She will never have to live the way I lived. But the transition wasn't easy or universally successful. Many letters describe women who struggled desperately to survive as their previous means of income disappeared. A heartbreaking series of letters from a woman called Tertia documents her gradual descent into poverty and desperation. The Christians say they want to help us, she writes, but their help comes with so many conditions. I must attend services twice daily. I must confess my sins publicly. I must accept their oversight of every aspect of my life. Sometimes I think slavery was more honest. At least then I knew exactly what was expected of me. The most fascinating letters come from women who found ways to use their previous experience as assets in their new lives. A woman named Lydia established herself as a counselor for other women leaving prostitution. Using her understanding of the psychological and practical challenges involved, her letters describe developing what we would now recognize as therapy techniques, helping women process trauma and build new identities. Another woman, calling herself Magna, used her business skills and client connections to establish a textile trading company. Her letters reveal sophisticated understanding of market economics and international trade that she had developed during her years as a courtesan. The skills that made me successful in my previous life, she writes, are the same skills that allow me to succeed now. I understand people, I can negotiate, and I know how to build relationships that benefit everyone involved. The religious conversion experiences described in these letters are complex and deeply personal. Many women describe genuine spiritual awakenings that provided meaning and purpose they had never experienced before. But others reveal more pragmatic motivations. Conversion offered social acceptance, economic opportunities, and legal protections that weren't available to unconverted sex workers. One letter that particularly stands out was written by a former high-end courtesan named Julia to her daughter. She describes the moment she realized that Christianity might offer her child a chance at respectability that would be impossible otherwise. I do not know if I truly believe everything they teach, she writes honestly, but I know that your future depends on my being able to give you a new name, a new history, and a new place in the world. The letters also document the practical challenges of building new lives from nothing. Women describe learning domestic skills they had never needed before, navigating social customs they didn't understand, and building relationships with people who had very different life experiences. Many expressed gratitude for the patience and kindness of Christian women who helped them adapt. But others described feeling isolated and judged by communities that claimed to welcome them. The economic struggles were real and ongoing. A woman named Priska writes about working as a baker's assistant for wages that were less than half what she had earned as a prostitute. "I am always hungry now," she explains, "but I am also always hopeful. My old life provided for my body but starved my soul. This new life starves my body but feeds something deeper." But perhaps the most revealing letters are those that discuss the relationships these women formed with each other during this transition period. Many describe creating informal support networks with other former sex workers, sharing resources, information, and emotional support during the difficult process of reinventing themselves. These relationships often lasted for decades and provided stability that neither their previous work nor their new religious communities could offer. The letters also reveal fascinating details about how Roman society gradually adapted to the disappearance of institutionalized prostitution. Former clients write to women they had known professionally, sometimes offering legitimate employment opportunities or asking for business advice. Some express genuine concern for their welfare and provide financial assistance during the transition period. One remarkable series of letters documents the relationship between a former courtesan named Helena and Marcus Aurelius Severus, a senator who'd been one of her regular clients for over 5 years. After her conversion to Christianity, he helped her establish a small school for girls from poor families. Their letters reveal a genuine friendship that transcended their previous commercial relationship and created something beneficial for both of them. The archaeological context of these letters provides additional insights into how these women saw their own stories. The fact that someone carefully preserved and hid them suggests that these women understood their experiences were historically significant and deserved to be remembered. They weren't just surviving a personal transition, they were witnessing and documenting one of the most important social transformations in human history. The final letters in the collection, dated to around 450 CE, show women who had successfully established new lives writing to encourage others still struggling with the transition. They describe building careers, raising families, and finding genuine happiness in ways that had seemed impossible during their previous lives, but they also acknowledge the losses, the friendships, the independence, and sometimes the financial security they had given up. These personal accounts reveal that the end of Roman prostitution wasn't just a policy change or a moral reform. It was a human drama involving thousands of individual women who had to reinvent themselves completely in order to survive. Their stories show us the real cost of massive social change and the incredible capacity of human beings to adapt, grow, and find meaning even in the most difficult circumstances. Reading these letters has fundamentally changed how I understand this entire historical period. These weren't just abstract social forces at work. They were real people making impossible choices and finding ways to build meaningful lives from the fragments of a world that no longer existed. And as we reach the end of our journey through the hidden world of Roman prostitution, these voices remind us that history isn't just about laws and institutions and cultural movements. It's about individual human beings trying to find dignity, purpose, and happiness in whatever circumstances they face. The lessons these women learned about survival, transformation, and hope are as relevant today as they were 1,500 years ago. As we come to the end of this incredible journey through the hidden world of Roman prostitution, I want to leave you with a story that captures everything we've discovered about human nature, social change, and the power of individual choice to shape history. It's the story of the last known Roman prostitute, a woman whose final act of defiance became a symbol of everything this world had been and everything it was about to become. Her name was Theodora, and yes, she's the same Theodora who had become one of the most powerful empresses in Byzantine history. But before she ruled an empire alongside Justinian, she worked as an actress and courtesan in Constantinople during the final decades when the old Roman sexual culture still existed alongside the new Christian moral order. Her transformation from sex worker to empress represents the ultimate expression of the social mobility that Roman prostitution had always offered. But it also marks the definitive end of that world. Theodora's early life reads like a summary of everything we've learned about women's experiences in this profession. Born into poverty, she entered the entertainment industry as a child and gradually moved into sex work as she matured. But she was exceptionally intelligent, extraordinarily beautiful, and possessed political instincts that allowed her to navigate the complex world of late Roman sexuality with remarkable success. What makes her story so significant is how she used every skill that sex workers had developed over centuries to achieve something that had never been possible before: legitimate political power, her ability to read people, her understanding of psychology, her talent for performance, her business acumen, and her network of connections all became assets that she deployed in service of genuine historical change. When Theodora met Justinian, she wasn't just a beautiful woman seeking a wealthy patron. She was a sophisticated political actor who understood exactly how to present herself as an invaluable partner rather than a decorative accessory. Their relationship began as a business alliance between two ambitious people who recognized each other's talents, and it evolved into a genuine partnership that transformed the Roman world. But here's what's most remarkable. Instead of hiding her past, Theodora used it as a source of authority and insight that informed her policies as empress. She became one of history's most effective advocates for women's rights, using her personal experience to understand the needs and vulnerabilities of women who had no other voice in imperial politics. The laws she championed tell the story of everything we've learned about Roman prostitution. She established legal protections for actresses and entertainers who were often forced into sex work. She created programs to help women leave prostitution and establish independent lives. She even passed legislation that allowed former prostitutes to marry into the aristocracy, essentially legalizing the kind of social mobility that had always existed informally but had never been officially recognized. Most importantly, she used her position to document and preserve the experiences of women who had lived through the transformation we've been exploring. The historical records we have of late Roman prostitution exist largely because Theodora ensured that these stories were recorded and preserved rather than forgotten or destroyed. Her reign represents the final chapter of our story because it shows how the skills, knowledge, and perspectives that had developed within Roman sex work culture were ultimately integrated into the broader fabric of civilization. The end of Roman prostitution wasn't just about eliminating an industry. It was about transforming the insights and capabilities of the women involved into something that could benefit society as a whole. And that's really what this entire story's been about: human adaptability, resilience, and the capacity to find dignity and meaning, even in the most challenging circumstances. The women we've met tonight, from Cytheris in her luxurious villa to Flavia in her stone cell, from Fortunata learning to read scripture to Theodora ruling an empire, all demonstrate something fundamental about human nature that transcends any particular historical period. They show us that people can survive and even thrive in systems designed to exploit them. They reveal how individuals can use intelligence, creativity, and determination to transform not just their own lives, but the entire social structures around them. Most importantly, they remind us that every human being possesses inherent dignity and potential that no circumstance can completely destroy. The lessons from their world are surprisingly relevant to our modern struggles with sexuality, gender equality, economic justice, and social change. We're still grappling with many of the same questions about consent, exploitation, agency, and empowerment that shape their daily lives. We're still trying to balance individual freedom with social responsibility, economic necessity with moral values, and personal choice with collective well-being. What these women teach us is that change is possible, that transformation is always within reach, and that the most marginalized members of society often possess insights and capabilities that can benefit everyone if we're wise enough to listen and learn from their experiences. Their stories also remind us that history isn't just about powerful men making important decisions in marble buildings. It's about ordinary people living extraordinary lives, making difficult choices, and finding ways to create meaning and purpose regardless of their circumstances. The women of Roman prostitution were historians, economists, psychologists, entrepreneurs, spiritual leaders, and social innovators whose contributions to human civilization have been largely overlooked and undervalued. As we close this exploration, I'm struck by how much these ancient women have to teach us about courage, intelligence, and hope. They lived through one of the most dramatic social transformations in human history, and they not only survived it, they shaped it in ways that continue to influence our world today. Their legacy lives on in every woman who refuses to be defined by society's limitations, every person who transforms personal trauma into wisdom that helps others, and every individual who recognizes that human dignity can never be bought, sold, or taken away regardless of circumstances. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through time and human experience. These stories have changed how I understand history, human nature, and the power of individual choice to shape collective destiny. I hope they've done the same for you. The world of Roman prostitution may be gone, but the lessons these remarkable women learned about survival, transformation, and hope remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. Their voices, preserved in graffiti and letters and legal documents, continue to speak to us across the centuries, reminding us that every human story matters and that even the most challenging circumstances can become opportunities for growth, change, and ultimately, redemption. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you soon with another incredible story from history's hidden corners. Until then, remember that every person you meet is living a story as complex and meaningful as any we've explored tonight. The only difference is that their story is still being written,